First reading this morning is from the prophet Ezekiel. And he and Isaiah were contemporaries. And so what happened, Ezekiel is doing the same thing that Isaiah was doing at that time. And that was they were trying to warn the leaders of Judaism, do not ally yourself with the Egyptians. And so what happens, he said, do not ally yourself, don't with the Egyptians. But that seemed like the politically expedient thing to do. And so the king of Israel, he allied himself with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were beaten. And they were beaten by the Babylonians. And so in the year 587, Babylonia invaded both the North Galilee and Judah, and even Samaria. And what they would do was they would take men, any of the men in any of those places, and they would take them to Babylon, and they would send settlers in, and the settlers' job was to intermarry with the women of that land, because what happened was they always took the name and the heritage of the man, not the woman. Some of you might be Polish, German. Well, they didn't do that. They just said one, and if somebody married a Babylonian, there were Babylonians. That's why you read in the Gospels about the Good Samaritan. The Galileans and the Judeans, north and south, they hated the Samaritans because the Samaritans intermarried with the Babylonians. You may remember, if you've seen the musical, it escapes me at the moment, but where there were 5 daughters, and the one's going to marry a Gentile, and the father said she will be dead to us if she does that. You could only marry another observant Jew, and if you didn't do that, well, then they regarded you as a heretic. That's why the Jews and the Samaritans hated each other, was because the Samaritan women intermarried with the Babylonians, whereas the Galilean women and the Judean women did not. And so it is that I say in the late, I should say the early 6th century, because before Christ you count backwards. That's why I say in 587, the men of actually all three of the Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, all 3 of them were taken into exile. But the women of Galilee and Judea would not marry the Babylonians, but the Samaritans did. And so the Samaritans, as far as they were concerned, were heretics because they had married Gentiles and intermarried with them. That's why the parable of the Good Samaritan works, because they would think the worst of a Samaritan. They would think that a Samaritan, if for people in the ditch, the Samaritan would go down and probably rob them further. But Jesus, in this parable, what happens is the Samaritan has mercy on this Judean man who's been beaten, puts him in a hostel or really a hotel, we would say. And he says, take care of this guy, and on my way back, I'll pay you anything that the hospitalization of this man caused. A Jew would have trouble getting his head around that, because he would say they would think the Samaritan wouldn't bother with him if he did anything, or if he did anything, he'd rob him. But that's not what the Samaritan does. And what it does is it forces the man who's in the ditch, who was a Judean, forces him to say, maybe the Samaritans aren't as bad as we thought. This guy's capable of doing good things for us. And so this first reading then is a story of good and evil, and it's a story of acceptance. Whom do you and I accept? And what Jesus is saying is, take an enemy and accept him or her. Very, very unlike. A Jew would be puzzled by that. because they would think, well, the Samaritan, we don't like them. But this guy's done a work of mercy for somebody who was his enemy, namely a Judean. And he says to the innkeeper, take care of this guy, and I'll pay you whatever it costs on my way home. And as I say, a Jew hearing that would say, I don't get it. He shouldn't help this guy. If anything, he should rob him. But he doesn't. And that's the point of really the whole reading is this morning. Can you imagine if the same thing happened to you and I'm not sure who our enemy of the United States is now. I mean, a Russian came along and helped one of us and got us hospital, and had us cared for. It's the same thing that's going on in this reading. Second reading is equally interesting. What happened is Paul is suffering from something, and he doesn't like it. And so he asked God to cure him. As they say, we don't know what that suffering was. It could have been some physical disability, could have been illness, could be some recurring temptation. It could be plots of his opponents. But what he said, and which is, I think, practical for you and me, he says, I'm not going to cure you because in weakness, power reaches perfection. And what he means by that is all of us have weaknesses. If I said this morning, would anybody who's never had a weakness or a suffering please come up here? I'd have to sit down myself. Because all of us have had that. We've had that, and St. Paul, therefore, is giving you and me a very practical directive. And that is, in weakness, power reaches perfection. What that means is, it means that what it forces you and me to do, it forces us to turn to God and say, I need your help. Otherwise, I can't deal with this. How many of us have said this? I have. Have we all? If you don't help me, I don't know what I'll do because this thing is overwhelming me. And St. Paul says, this is what happened to me. He says, but I believed, and he said, what would God let me know? He said, in my weakness in some way, I'll be put in contact with the strength of God. And in a sense, what he says is, that's all I need. If I have God's strength, I can manage whatever is sent my way. Maybe you have done the same thing, had some issue rise in your life for which you say, Lord, this is bad news. Can you help me? And maybe he says the same thing to you and to me. Well, I'll tell you what. Just trust in me, and in some way we'll deal with this. But also remember what I said to St. Paul. In weakness, power reaches perfection. Jesus in the gospel he's rejected because they don't seem to know who he is because he's from their territory. It would be the same thing as if we had we Augustinians. Our Bishop Bob Prevost just made a cardinal. I taught him. Well, I thought he might be going place. I never thought he'd be a cardinal. And I'm too old, but I'm afraid if he asked me to come over to Rome to be a secretary or something like that. But I see that crutch. I'd use it all the time. I think that'd discourage him. But as I say, we Augustinians at first we couldn't believe it. We weren't surprised. He's a really good guy. But the point was he was a bishop, and the thing that won the Pope over was during El Nino, Bishop Prevost had hip boots on, was with his people shoveling out water. And the Pope saw that, he liked them immediately, because he said it would be like shepherds. And so the Pope made him head of this they call it a dicastery, and the dicastery is the one that suggests men to be bishops to the Pope, and normally the Pope will listen to them. The Archbishop of Chicago is on that committee, and in fact, Bob told me, he said, yeah, he had him out for dinner last night. I think he wanted to run a couple things past him in terms of bishops. One of the things that could be is we may have, in this time, they may have done business with Joseph as a carpenter. He said, this is a carpenter's son. What's he talking about? That he's somebody special, even the Son of God. Others know the members of his family, and even if you have 10 minutes this morning, open to St. Mark's Gospel, chapter 3, verse 22. And what that is, Mark 3, verses 22 and following, Jesus' people come after him because they think he's having a breakdown. They think that he thinks he's the Messiah. We better go get him before he does something really foolish and goes around preaching that. And he even escaped from them. There seemed to be nothing extraordinary about him. As I say, they knew him. They knew his father Joseph was the carpenter, and he helped his father on occasion. So what's the big deal about that? And so, as I say, they don't look at the extraordinary events. One of the real puzzles that I have with a lot of this stuff, he would cure a person, and the Pharisees would come after him because he cured on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. So he cures some poor guy's blindness, or a person who is crippled, or a person I'm sure is mentally or emotionally challenged, and he cured them. You would think the Pharisees would say, this guy, because of what he claims, God can't give. If he's lying, God can't supervise that and let him get away with that stuff. But he does. So you would think they would say, therefore there must be something to what he's claiming. But they don't. And he tries at first to turn him away, but it doesn't work. And so what it is, they even plot, one of the ironies of the crucifixion is the fact that they crucify it for the worst criminals. They crucify a guy who's never committed a sin. Now the other two guys on either side of him were bad guys. And even at the last moment, he saves the guy on his right. He says to the guy on his left, stop talking to him like that. And he says to Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says to him, this day, you will be with me in paradise. This guy, he got home late, but he got there. Because Jesus, even on the cross, even as he suffered, was willing to think of others than himself. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Can you imagine having spikes driven through your wrist and on your feet, and still ask for the guys who are pounding and seem to enjoy it, for God to forgive them? But that's exactly what he does. And isn't it true that many times Christ has acted through people towards us? Isn't it true that many times that we have found that in weakness we are strong because God acts through people just like us? Maybe he's asked us to act towards other people. Listen to them. Sometimes you have to listen to the same story again and again. It's all right. If it helps this person, it's all right. That's what the gospel today says. The second reading says the same thing. Actually, the first reading says the same thing. When we are weak, then we are strong. And so what Ezekiel says in this first reading this morning, he says, we have to be bearer of unpopular news. They didn't do what he and Isaiah told them to do, namely, make some kind of a treaty with the Babylonians. They allied with the Egyptians, and then the Babylonians beat the Egyptians and came in and took all the Judeans, took them hostage, sent their males to Babylonia for 49 years. And then they were freed. They were freed by Cyrus, who was another Galilean. I'm sorry, another pagan. Paul, he wants control over his faults, but God tells him, no, just trust in us and we'll take care of you. Power reaches perfection in weakness. That's something that we probably all put on our minds and not forget it. And finally, Jesus is rejected because they don't accept the extraordinary things that he does. So, as I say, it's a real question why they don't. But what they do is they go after him because he cures on the Sabbath. You know, how dopey can they be? But they were dopey, and then they try to get him, and succeeded in getting someone who was sinless put to death. When I am weak, it is then, St. Paul says, it is then that I am strong. Amen.